I've often thought that if the Bible was made into a movie, it would be rated R for sex, violence, murder, betrayal. All of that is in the Bible, and it's all in Second Samuel. If you like that stuff, check out Second Samuel. It's 24 chapters of graphic betrayal, sex, violence, murder. All of this is in there. But also in there is, I think, the way out. Begins the process of giving us the way out of these intense conflicts. It all centers around this guy named David. David is the second king of Israel, and everybody imitates who David is. Everybody wants to be like David. They want some essence of David. He's the king, and everybody wants to be the top dog, right? I'm sure that you felt this in your life. Well, this leads to conflict. Very early on in the story of 2 Samuel, Saul has died. And if you remember, Saul is the first king of Israel. Saul goes after David, wants to kill David, because David is gaining in popularity in Israel. And Saul sees David as a threat to Saul's kingship. Well, David doesn't want to become king. He doesn't want to overtake Saul. In fact, he goes out of his way to save Saul's life numerous times. He respects Saul. He thinks Saul has been chosen for an important mission to become king. And when he actually commits suicide, Saul does. And when he hears about this, David laments Saul. Even this guy who's going after his life, David weeps. The text says David weeps for Saul. And why does he do that? It doesn't make any sense to me. Like, I would be in this great joy if the person who was coming after me all of a sudden died, right? David weeps. David ends up becoming king. People love David. And David ends up taking advantage of his kingship. Remember, David, when he was chosen by Samuel to become king, was the shepherd, the youngest member of his family, and the shepherd of his family's flock. Why is this important? Because David protects those who are defenseless, the sheep. Well, David becomes king, and while he's on the roof of his palace, he looks out and he sees this woman, Bathsheba. And Bathsheba, he's attracted to her, and he calls somebody over and asks who this person is. Well, he finds out that Bathsheba is Uriah's wife. Uriah is a general in David's army. David knows who Uriah is, and in spite of this, he says to Bathsheba, come over, and they end up having sex, and Bathsheba gets pregnant. Well, David tries to hide this. You can see this, I think it's chapter 6 of 2 Samuel, and he can't hide it, so he ends up trying to kill Uriah. He sends Uriah to the front lines so that he will be sure to be killed. It's a fascinating story. But Nathan, there's a prophet named Nathan. Nathan knows about this happening, and he comes to David. He tells David a story. He says this: there are two men, neighbors. One is rich and the other is poor. One has one sheep, and the rich man has tons of sheep. Well, the rich man throws a party, and instead of taking his own sheep, he goes to the poor man's sheep and takes that and kills it, and they end up eating that sheep. And Nathan's like, what do you think of this? And David's like, he gets all outraged. He's like, it shouldn't happen. That guy deserves to die. And Nathan says, you are that man. And David goes, oh, I am. There's this self-reflection that's going on in 2 Samuel. There's self-critique that's going on. David knows that he has done something wrong here. He knows that he shouldn't kill those who are trying to kill him. And this is a theme that happens throughout the story. So there's this woman of Tekoa, in chapter 14. This is a fascinating story. She says maybe the most sane thing in the whole book. She's talking with David, and she says this to David: God doesn't take away life, but seeks to bring people back. Bring people back to God and bring people back to one another. This is what God does. God's not a part of all of this violence that's going on in 2 Samuel, even though sometimes the text says that God is involved. It seems like God is involved in all of this, but here we have the woman of Tekoa saying God has nothing to do with that. God doesn't take away life, but seeks to bring people back. In chapter 16, there's this beautiful story of a man named Shimei. He's from the clan of Saul, and David is walking along the road, and Shimei comes out, and he starts cursing David. He says, "You are a scoundrel and a man of blood." And David is taking this, and David has his greatest military advisor. His name is Joab. Joab's a bit of a hawk, and Joab's like, "Let's kill this guy. Do you hear what he's saying to you? He's saying you are a scoundrel and a man of blood." And David says, he's kind of right. Don't kill this guy. I need to hear this. This is what David is saying. He's like, I am a man of blood. He's only saying the truth. And so David is going through this self-critique of what's going on. There's the last self-critique that I want to point out, if you've been following along in this series. The Exodus story is the pivotal event. And what God says after the Exodus is, don't go back to the ways of Egypt. Don't go back to the ways of oppression. Well, we see here how David is going back to the ways of Egypt with Bathsheba, with this violence. And David is seeing this and critiquing it within his own life. And in chapter 20, verse 24, we see this critique that the authors are making against David's Israel. It says there's this man named Adoniram who's in charge of forced labor. You can't miss this. And they make bricks. The forced laborers make bricks. This is exactly what Israel was doing in Egypt. So whereas everybody is imitating David, trying to be like David, David's Israel is imitating Egypt and going back to the ways of Egypt. Well, all of this in the end leads to the civil war of Israel and Judah. They end up coming back together again. But it leads to this internal violence. David, I think, begins the process of seeing how we can get out of this self-critique, and that violence is not the way the world is supposed to be. So those are my thoughts on 2 Samuel. God doesn't take away life, but seeks to bring people back to God and to one another. Chapter 14, verse 14. I love that. So anyway, let me know your thoughts.